Audeze is known for its audiophile headphones. In the last few years, they've tried to jump onto the gaming bandwagon and introduce two headphones aimed at gamers. Their initial release was the Mobius, a $400 headphone which gets nothing but complete derision from me for its abysmal performance and gimmicks. Audeze's second iteration was the Penrose, a $300 headphone that took away the Mobius's gimmick features but retained everything else troubling about the Mobius. Most recently, Audeze released the LCD GX. This is a $1,000 headphone based off the LCD series design. I purchased the GX at a steep discount from an authorized Audeze dealer. I will not disclose which, considering Audeze's penchant for punishing both its customers and its dealers. The GX is marketed towards both gamers and audiophiles. This will be a two-part review. In part 1, we will discuss the GX's sound signature and performance in regards to audiophiles. In part 2, we will discuss the GX's performance in regards to gaming. Since this video is centered on audiophile performance, I'm going to limit discussion in this section to Audeze's promises in this regard. Audeze says that the GX is perfect for monitoring, mixing, and editing audio. They vaguely compare the GX to other gaming headphones and say that the GX has, quote, wider, more accurate soundstage, and better bass, and outstanding resolution. Audeze promises that the GX combines, quote, the finest sound quality with clear voice chat for the serious, purist audiophile gamer. As you can probably tell, Audeze's marketing is incredibly vague and overly pretentious. They do not provide even the merest hint regarding this headphone's sound signature. Audeze's principal aim with their marketing is to create a new category of customer, the serious audiophile gamer. By the way, I said this headphone is $1,000, and that is an accurate statement. While Audeze's MSRP is $900, the taxes and potential shipping costs inflate the overall expenditure to about $1,000. This is why I'm going to refer to the GX as a $1,000 headphone, because it is. The GX has the same overall structure as other large LCD headphones, but for the red accent on the vents, you might be mistaking the GX for one of the other LCD headphones from a distance. One of the characteristics of the LCD series is their weight. They are large and arguably bulky. Some people complain about the weight. The very first surprising aspect about the GX is how light it actually is. The GX is about 6 ounces lighter than the LCD2. The GX, however, is about 3 ounces heavier than the Mobius and Penrose. While you may not notice a significant difference in weight between the GX and the two other Audeze Gamer headphones, you will notice a difference between the GX and, say, the LCD2 Classic. The GX uses magnesium in the metal structure. There's not a single piece of plastic component visible anywhere. The ear cups, yokes, headband, cable inserts, adjustment poles, and even the pole retainers are all metal. The GX uses the characteristic large ear pads which are glued onto the headphone. These are memory foam and rebound slowly. The ear pads feel soft. There's enough room for them to sit around average-sized ears. Unfortunately, Audeze continues its stubborn refusal to provide padding in the headband. There's only a thin layer of leather. The GX comes in a fairly standard carrying box. It is well padded and perfectly fits this headphone. Audeze provides 2 sets of cables with the GX, a standard LCD mini XLR cable and a special mini XLR cable with a microphone on the left side. The microphone is of Audeze's own design. Included in the box is a headphone and microphone splitter for use with PCs. The standard cable is no different from any other stock Audeze cable. It is cheap looking, cheap feeling, and prone to considerable microphonics. The microphone cable is, well, let me put it this way. If you recall the debacle that was the vocal erupt, then you will understand why people were so upset with the erupt's laughably bad cables. The GX's microphone cable is not as bad as the vocal erupts, but that is not really a compliment. This cable is hands down the worst Audeze has ever thrown into a box. It is made of the same cheap material as any off-the-shelf third-party cable you can buy on Amazon. Microphonics are fairly bad with this cable. One glimmer of hope is the microphone boom arm. It is easy to move and will stay in place wherever you position it. It is among the better implementations I've used so far. As for comfort, the GX is easily the most comfortable LCD headphone I've ever worn. The clamping force seems to be just about right. The ear pads are supple and soft. The overall weight is low enough that I can wear the GX for about 3 hours before needing a break. However, the lack of headband padding is something that will cause issues for some people. Overall, the GX is built really well. I cannot fault Audeze for the construction. One note of importance I need to emphasize is the care you must employ when handling this headphone and, in fact, all LCD headphones. Audeze's driver design is terribly prone to damage with pressure change. Do not press the ear cups onto your head. Do not press the ear cups against your palms. Do not put the headphones on too quickly. I know this may sound odd to some, but this is a real problem with Audeze's headphones, one which resulted in a Reddit debate last year. Unfortunately, Audeze does not provide this notice on any of its headphone product pages or even in the product manual. This information is buried in Audeze's FAQ. As for the presentation of this headphone, look, I think the accessories leave something to be desired. Audeze clearly does not care enough to provide a luxury cable with their purportedly luxurious headphones. All LCD headphones come with the same microphonic-prone plastic-covered cable. You can spend $800 or $4,000 on LCD headphones and the stock cable will not change. This is somewhat disappointing if you ask me. The protective case is a good addition considering the money you're paying. But the biggest issue is the microphone cable. It is inexcusably badly constructed. It is prone to kinks, microphonics, and does not in any way look or feel like a cable for a nearly $1,000 headphone. Another factor you have to consider is that you cannot replace this microphone cable with an alternative. As far as I know, there are no third-party options for a microphone cable to fit the GX. And Audeze so far does not provide a more suitable option for this $1,000 headphone. To determine the sound signature, I listened to the GX on various sources. This included the Shit Magni Heresy and Songcause LAQX-D1 stack, the RME 80i2 DAC, the Earman TR amp, and the Sound Blaster G6. I used the stock ear pads and cable. I played my test playlist through Amazon Music HD. It's imperative that you look at the GX's webpage for the power requirement. Audeze says that the GX needs a minimum of 100 milliwatts and at least 250 milliwatts for peak performance. All of the devices I used in my test provided power within these parameters. We will discuss how this impacts gamers in the second video. Audeze merely says that the GX has better bass than other gaming headphones. Frankly, I have no idea what that means. But my tests indicate that the GX has a sub-bass roll-off and close to neutral mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the GX provided some of the rumbling that is present from the beginning of the song. The sub-bass had fast transients and seemed to be a bit distant, less obvious than on the neutral Allo Audio S4X. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the track, the GX presented the organ no more than one step ahead of other instruments. There was noticeable melding among instruments, though nothing sounded veiled or muddy. When the vocals chimed in at the end, they rose from the background until they were about one step ahead of the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there is a rolling marble effect at the beginning of the track. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The GX did present the sound of the rolling marbles, but they did not pan, instead remained centered. There are multiple drums in this track, and the GX rendered all of them. They did not have a visceral slam, the type you will hear from the Audeze LCD XC or the One More Triple Driver, for example. Instead, the GX's rendition of drums made them sound a bit blunted, like there was a thin sheet over the drum head, absorbing some of the energy. Each drum strike was fairly clear, and I never struggled to hear the instruments. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. The GX had a distant presentation of sub-bass. The subwoofer sounded like it was in an adjacent room. The decay was fast. The drums were clear, but not sharp or piercing. Vocals were 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their characteristic sparkle. To further test the sub-bass response, I listened to the Sicario soundtrack. This album has a generous use of bass instruments and lingering sub-bass emphasis. The GX simply could not recreate the sub-bass accurately. While the drums were obvious in a mix, the rumbling subwoofer effects were more distant, faster, and noticeably underemphasized than when I compared the GX against the Allo S4X. Overall, I would say that the GX has a typical planar magnetic sub-bass roll-off. Most dynamic driver headphones have audibly greater sub-bass rendition. The GX has good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, which means that you will not hear muddy or veiled bass. However, the bass is not particularly detailed, and certainly not more so than the dynamic driver headphones like the Aulo S4X and S4R. Audeze makes no statement regarding the mids response on the GX. My test suggests that the GX has forward mids with sibilant vocals. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there's natural grain and sibilance recorded into the track. The GX provided both of these details and noticeable emphasis for both. Orla's sibilance and vocal grain was above and beyond neutral on the GX. Compared to the neutral S4X and Avantone Planar, the GX had sibilance that was very close to my personal pain threshold, and only slightly less than that of the HD560S. The guitar and drums appeared to have correct timbre, and both instruments were clear, melding notes only very slightly. Orla's voice was about 2 steps ahead of the instruments. In Want You Back by Haim, the GX again showed that it noticeably accentuates sibilance. The primary vocalist sibilance was more neutral on the S4X and Avantone Planar, while it was nearly harsh on the GX. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The GX presented this detail, but it seemed just a little muffled compared to the Avantone Planar and the S4X. The GX allowed the 2 backup vocalists to retain their distinct voices when they first started singing. When the instruments played at maximum, all 3 vocals melded into one. However, with close attention, I could still pick each voice apart from the others. The drums, piano, guitar, and bass all appeared to have correct tonalities. There was marginal melding among their notes. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the GX correctly recreated the ukulele and drums. However, the bass was distant and recessed. The GX emphasized the primary vocalist sibilance as well, though not quite as much as with female vocalists. There is a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primary singers. However, the GX was simply not able to separate the two. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are supposed to be sharp intakes of breaths. The GX recreated that detail. Overall, the GX has clear yet not intimate mids. Vocals are sibilant, and if there's grain mixed in, the GX will emphasize it. Instruments sound correct, and there's some melding of notes. However, generally, the GX does not have a veiled or muddy sound. Audeze does not say how the GX is supposed to present the treble. In my tests, the GX had close to neutral treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the GX presented the brass and horns with their characteristic energy. They cut through the other instruments without sounding harsh. Their nasally signatures were easily audible but not emphasized. I could not hear individual instruments, but group sets were easily distinguishable. The GX does have some depth but no verticality. In other words, some group sets appeared closer than others, but I never heard sounds coming from above or below. In Flat from the City, the GX presented the piano as if it was about 5 feet away. Its bassier notes were well controlled and not boomy. In all honesty, the bassy notes seemed a bit under-emphasized. I could generally hear the electric buzzing and pops and sizzles, details that are recorded into the bottom layer of this track. However, both details were not patently obvious at all times, and there were many occasions when the GX simply could not clearly present them. I could also hear the creaking of the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello, but as with the other details I mentioned here, these were a bit muffled. The cello was smooth and melded with the piano, marginally. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the GX presented the piano in the right, the drums in the left, the saxophone center, and the bass recessed behind all of them. There was good separation among instruments, but some melding among the various notes. I could hear the varying sounds of the cymbals as they were struck in different spots. The saxophone was smooth and about 1 step ahead of the other instruments. Overall, the treble presentation is smooth, clear, and likely not going to cause fatigue for most people. Instruments have good separation among each other. Even when listening at high volumes, the GX never made any treble instrument sound peaky or piercing. The GX has nothing special to offer in regards to detail. Having compared dozens of headphones, it is rare that I find a headphone that comes close to reaching HD 800S levels in detail retrieval. The GX, despite whatever marketing and commentary you may have been subjected to, is not a detail monster. It has an inconsistent presentation of detail. For example, detail among treble instruments is mostly clear and distinct. I could hear the differing sounds as the cymbals in take 5 were struck at different speeds and positions, but I could not hear the slight perturbations of brass instruments. The sounds of pops and sizzles and electric buzzing were audible in flight from the city, but not all the time. In fact, these details were sometimes a bit difficult to separate from the instruments. The mids are generally clear. Multiple vocals are discernible, though when instruments play at maximum, you will need to pay close attention to separate the various voices. Instruments have marginal melding of notes, and it was never difficult to hear one instrument apart from another. The bass has a noticeable sub-bass roll-off, which helps in the separation of sub-bass and mid-bass region. There is little melding here. I would say that the GX provides most obvious details, sometimes subtle ones, and there is some inconsistency overall. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This song has layers of details, including the sounds of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps. The Full Count Clear presents 18. The Austrian Audio Hi-X65 presents 17. The Austrian Audio Hi-X55 presents 16. The Hi-Fi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, and Beyerdynamic DT1990 present 10 to 11. The Audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8 footsteps. The Monolith M1070 and M1570 provide 8 to 9. The older M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The Audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 provides 5 to 6. The Sifka P2 presents 10 to 11 footsteps. And the Audeze LCD GX provides 8 footsteps. The GX's performance in this test was consistent with my listening experience. When I talk about detail retrieval, I have a spectrum I refer to. In my mind, the HD6XX has average detail retrieval as far as audiophile headphones are concerned. Since a lot of people have the HD6XX, it makes sense to use it as a starting point. How other headphones perform compared to the 6XX leads me to say whether they are above average or below average, and in very few circumstances whether they excel in detail retrieval. Here, it is obvious that the GX has slightly above average detail retrieval. The biggest issue, the one that I kept hearing over and over again, is the lack of clarity for subtle details. Obvious elements will be audible, but when a track becomes complex, the GX cannot really render nuanced details. The GX, like the other large LCD headphones, has respectable soundstage. The problem I keep seeing is that people constantly compare the LCD headphones soundstage to a very limited experience base. I try to be a little bit more clear. Just like with the detail test, my soundstage test has an average starting point. It is, once again, the HD6XX. That headphone has average soundstage. With this in mind, let's talk about soundstage from one end of the spectrum to the other. The Audeze Mobius and Every Beats headphone I've ever heard have claustrophobic soundstage. The Neumann NDH20 and Audio-Technica M60X have below average soundstage. The LCD1, LCD2 Closed, and HD6XX have average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, Allo Audio S4X, Austrian Audio Hi-X55 and 65, LCD2 Classic, and Monolith M1570 have above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mandiva has wide soundstage. The Sennheiser HD800S has super wide soundstage. I would say that the GX has soundstage similar to that of the M1570, LCD2 Classic, Avantone Planar, and the Sundara. In other words, the GX has above average soundstage. It sits in good company, though obviously among cheaper products. When a company has a long-held house sound, then it can be difficult to get out of it and try something new. Audeze has been using the same sound signature for a very long time. There are variations among their headphones, but the structure is similar. They tend to have bass that bleeds into the mids and forward sibilant vocals. Treble is usually a bit elevated on LCD headphones. The GX ostensibly is made using the same technology as the other LCD headphones. Sure, there are some differences in driver design, but what exactly can you expect to hear? It appears that the GX has the same sub-bass roll-off as any other planar magnetic headphone. Fans of planar magnetic headphones keep talking about how good bass sounds on these drivers, but I do not think that is a rule, just a feeling from a group of people. The GX, like every other planar magnetic headphone I've ever heard, has a noticeable sub-bass roll-off. It isn't neutral. You will not hear full, rumbly bass. However, the GX does appear to have close to neutral mid-bass. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is obvious, so you will not hear a muddy sound signature in this region. The mids are forward and generally clear. Vocals are sibilant and grainy. If such details are in your tracks, the GX will emphasize them. If you are sensitive to sibilance, then the GX is going to be a problem for you. Vocals are typically 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. The treble is fairly neutral. I cannot imagine anyone would be offended by how the GX performs here. There is good clarity among instruments in this region and nothing sounds harsh or piercing. Saxophones, trombones, cymbals, pianos, everything is easy on the ears even at higher volumes. As for detail and soundstage performance, they are both above average. At no point did I think that the GX was performing better than alternative planar magnetic headphones. In fact, the dynamic driver headphones from Austrian Audio outperform the GX in detail, clarity, separation, placement, and match the GX's soundstage. Hopefully, that puts things into perspective. The point is this: the GX has Audeze's house sound, but understandably one with some deviation. I would say that the GX has one of the more smooth treble renditions of any LCD headphone I've heard. But the GX has the same mid-frequency emphasis that Audeze headphones are prone to. Sibilance and vocal grain is noticeably elevated on the Audeze headphones, and it is no different on the GX. The GX has a balanced sound signature. This headphone is not analytical. It is not warm sounding. There are plenty of balanced sounding headphones. The question for you is whether the GX is worth spending $1,000. No matter how much money you are about to spend, you need to compare and contrast products. That is the only way to figure out if your money is well spent. In this section, I will briefly compare the GX against alternatives. I decided to check the GX against the Avantone Planar, LCD2 Classic, Sivka P2, Hifi Mansundara, and the Monolith M1570. Of course, I could have used many other headphones, such as the Allo Audio S4X, the Austrian Audio headphones, and any one of my bare dynamic options, but I decided to keep things within the planar magnetic realm. When we get to the gaming performance in the next video, we will talk about dynamic driver options. I tested these headphones against the LCD GX using a passive AB switch that was plugged into my Army ADI2 DAC. I also counter-checked my findings using the Sterling SHA4 connected to the Soundcause LA-QXD1. I used stock earpads and cables. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I volume matched to the best of my ability. I have already thoroughly reviewed each of the competitor headphones and will only provide general comparisons here. The Avantone Planar and GX have very similar sub-bass performance. Both have a roll-off and it is hard to distinguish. Mid-bass impact is a little bit harder on the Avantone Planar. The GX in comparison has a slightly blunted effect. Clarity in the bass region is similar, but the Planar has more intimate presentation of drums. In other words, the Planar makes drum instruments sound closer to the ears. The rolling marble sound effect in Conquer is easily audible on the Planar, but not so much on the GX. Regarding mids presentation, there is no doubt that the Avantone Planar is neutral. The GX has forward mids. It emphasizes sibilance and vocal grain significantly when compared to the Planar. Timbre of instruments is the same on both headphones. Separation of instruments is very similar, but the GX has a slight edge here. Instruments tend to be a little bit easier to separate from each other on the GX, but this is not a night and day experience. Treble performance is similar. Both headphones are neutral or neutral-ish in this region. The GX has a bit more separation among instruments, and all instruments sound further away from the ears than on the Avantone Planar. However, the Planar provides a more 3D effect. Depending on the track, it presents instruments in a semicircle and with some verticality. The GX only provides some depth and distance, and no verticality. As for detail and soundstage, the headphones have some commonalities. Both are above average, but the GX has a slightly wider soundstage. In detail, the Planar is a bit clearer and overall provides more of it. The planar has a more intimate presentation of music. The GX pushes everything further back from the ears. The LCD2 Classic has a similar sub-bass roll-off as the LCD GX. The two headphones present fast transients, and it's hard to distinguish subwoofer effects on these headphones. However, it appears that the GX has a little bit more sub-bass emphasis than the Classic. Mid-bass impact is also very similar between these headphones. Neither has visceral drums. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is a little bit clearer on the Classic. The mids are hard to distinguish on these headphones. Both have sibilant vocals and emphasized grain. Switching back and forth, I could not tell if one was more sibilant than the other. They sounded about the same to me. Placement of vocals appears to be a little closer to the ears on the Classic. In other words, imagine a vocalist standing 3 feet away from you singing into your ears versus a vocalist 5 feet away. All instruments had about the same tonality on both headphones. Treble is a little different. The Classic has more treble emphasis than the GX. Instruments have a bit more energy and sound a little clearer on the Classic. Separation among treble instruments is more obvious on the Classic, whereas on the GX, instruments seem closer to each other. The Classic appears to have a slightly wider soundstage than the GX and a bit more clarity. The Classic also exhibits marginally greater detail retrieval. There seem to be very minor differences in bass response between the Pacifica P2 and the GX. It appeared that the GX had slightly greater emphasis in that region, but this was by no means a significant difference. Transience was similar on both headphones. Mid-bass impact was slightly harder on the P2 with sharper drum strikes. The GX sounded like it was a bit blunted. Again, the difference was not significant. Sub-bass and mid-bass separation was slightly greater on the B2, as was bass clarity. Both the P2 and the GX have similar bids response. Both push vocals forward, and both are sibilant. I think that the P2 is less sibilant than the GX. It appeared that the GX separates vocals from instruments less obviously than the P2, though once again, not by a wide margin. Instruments sounded the same on both headphones. As for treble response, it appears that the GX and P2 are fairly close to neutral. I think the GX is probably an inch closer to the neutral mark than the P2 when they are compared to each other. Clarity in this region is very similar, and there were some occasions when I thought that the GX might be a little clearer, but this was rather inconsistent. Soundstage is about the same on both headphones. Overall, the P2 has a little bit more clarity than the GX. Both the M1570 and GX have a sub-bass roll-off. However, it appears that the GX has a bit more emphasis in the sub-bass than the 1570. Transient seems to be marginally faster on the 1570. Mid-bass slam is very similar, however. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is greater on the 1570, as is bass clarity. This is not a night and day difference, but it is noticeable. Both the 1570 and GX have a sibilance emphasis. However, it appeared that the 1570's sibilance push was less pronounced and therefore less peaky. Vocal grain was smoother on the 1570. Vocals are further away from the ears on the 1570. Separation of vocals from instruments is marginally more obvious on the 1570. All instruments have the same timbre on both headphones. Treble is a little smoother on the 1570 and slightly rolled off on the upper treble region on this headphone. That means that the 1570 is a little easier to listen to at higher volumes. On the other hand, the GX is a bit closer to neutral. Separation of treble instruments is more obvious on the 1570. Instruments tend to sound further away from the ears on the 1570. Soundstage is wider on the 1570. Detail retrieval, however, is very similar to the GX. The Sundara's sub-bass also has a roll-off, and it is noticeably greater than that of the GX. Transience is slightly faster on the Sundara as well. Mid-bass impact is similar on these headphones. Clarity and separation between the sub-bass and mid-bass appears to be marginally greater on the Sundara. The Sundara's mids presentation is closer to neutral than the GX. The Sundara has very slightly emphasized sibilance, but the vocal grain appears to be more accurately presented. In comparison, the GX significantly emphasizes both. Vocals are closer to the ears on the GX and sound more full. The Sundara pushes vocals further away and appear to have less bass support. The timbre of instruments are the same on both headphones. Treble response is very similar on both headphones. Both are close to neutral in this regard. However, separation of treble instruments was a little bit clearer on the Sundara. The GX presented all instruments more intimately, closer to the ears. The Sundara has slightly wider soundstage. It also has overall more clarity and a bit more detailed retrieval. So, you heard me say the word similar many times in this section. You rarely heard me say the word same. That is because all of these headphones do not sound identical. Possibly the closest analogy to the GX is the LCD2 Classic. You would expect that considering they're from the same house. But what needs emphasis is that there are far cheaper alternatives whose performance is not necessarily worse than the GX. When I talk about performance, I do not mean sound signature. Sound signature is a personal preference which I try not to promote. When I say performance, I mean soundstage, clarity, detail retrieval, and instrument placement. Viewed with this definition, the GX's performance is not better than the cheaper options from Hi-Fi Man, Monolith, Sifka, and Avantone. Yes, all of these headphones have a different sound signature, and you may end up liking one more than another, but you may also end up hating all of them. The idea is that you are able to first set aside nonsensical hype so that you can focus on sound signature by yourself. When someone says that a headphone has the best performance or the widest soundstage or provides all the details, then all those statements need to be put into context. Here, with these comparisons, you now have some idea that the GX does not outperform in any of these categories. Yes, perhaps Audeze is correct when they say that the GX will outdo other gaming headphones. And to that, I have but one response. That is an incredibly low bar Audeze has set for itself. I will not talk about value just yet. Since gaming performance will need to be discussed in part 2, I will leave the issue of overall value to a later discussion. Here, let us simply talk about the sound signature and audiophile performance. The bottom line is that the GX is a fine headphone. All Audeze headphones except the Mobius and probably the Penrose are pleasing. Not everybody will like Audeze sound signature or the size of their headphones, and most will cringe at the Audeze price tag. But you simply cannot say that Audeze makes terrible headphones, except for the Mobius. I'm not sure who started this planar magnetic craze, but it really is not all that. Planar magnetic drivers have their own problems. Driver failure tends to be a more serious issue than with dynamic drivers, for example. Price is another factor. Size, weight, and convenience is yet another. And don't forget the power requirements for planar magnetic headphones. I know people talk about how amazing planar magnetic bass is, but I do not think it is better or worse than dynamic driver performance. It's just different. Here, with the GX, you get a fairly balanced sounding headphone. The sub-bass is as lackluster as with any other planar magnetic headphone. Mid-bass is close to neutral but does sound a little blunted. The mids are forward, and there is a significant sibilance in vocal grain emphasis. Treble is fairly neutral. Detail retrieval and soundstage are above average. You can achieve similar performance for half the price of the GX. You can get far greater clarity, resolution, detail, and object placement using some dynamic driver headphones, such as the Austrian Audio Hi-X55 and X65. And if you want neutral, then consider either the Avantone Planar or the Allo Audio S4X. The GX is yet another Audeze headphone that relies heavily on the Audeze house sound. You may or may not like that. At this point, I think you have to do some deep thinking before splurging $1,000 on the GX. And I think part 2 will put things into greater focus.